So the Bantu migration never happened, but what happened was a Zanj Moorish invasion, migration, destabilization, and gold fleecing of the gold-rich kingdoms of Africa between 600 and 1500 CE, before further destabilization and another gold fleecing by imperial European countries from 1500 CE onwards. The adoption of this inaccurate Bantu migration theory has been a result of ignoring African history before European imperialism. This history explains the origins and conditions that led to the formation of many of the modern ethnic groups in Africa today. Many that didn't exist before 900 CE and did not occupy the territories they currently do. Africa has a history before the late 1400s or Portuguese impression, and this video will cover a small part of it to explain why the Bantu migration never happened, but the Zanj and Moorish invasions did. To understand why the Bantu migration didn't happen, we have to start with the beginning of the fall of Aksum, which happened between 600 and 700 CE. So let's go to Aksum. The kingdom of Aksum rose on the heels of the decline of Rasha, or Kush. It was located in modern-day North Ethiopia and Eritrea. Cosmas, who traveled to India, that was his name translated to English, was a Greek writer who wrote about Aksum in 550 CE, right before it fell. On Aksum, Cosmas wrote that it was a devout Christian kingdom when he visited. The kingdom was ruled by the king Caleb, or Ella Asbeha, I hope I said his name correctly, who was a devout Christian king and dedicated to spreading Christianity. So we can say Christianity was in Africa way before the Europeans or Islam ever were. This king was also, quote, a great friend of the Romans, and maintained friendly relations with the Byzantine Empire, other Christian states, and Africa, with whom the kingdom carried out trade, so Aksum was like a middleman between the north and the south. Writings say his country was also abundant in gold. So at this point, Aksum controlled the ancient gold mines of Rasha, or Kush, as people call it. By the 600s, Aksum began to lose its control of the gold mines and influence. These 100 years between 600 and 700 CE saw the rise of Islam, which by 642 CE had completely conquered Egypt, so the north of Africa was now under expanding Islamic caliphates. The king of Aksum may have unintentionally contributed to this expansion and the fall of his own kingdom by protecting Islamic refugees in 615 CE, who were fleeing death sentences from their tribe in Mecca. They won his favor because they basically read out of the chapter of Mary, showing they knew Jesus. They knew to do this because Aksum had a Christian bias and favored anyone that showed an inclination towards Christianity. This targeting was often not violent, but entrenchment from within, which is what happened to Aksum and other African kingdoms. Over time, the Muslim or Islamic influence grew within Aksum, and they used Aksum as a base to regroup and stage the invasion of Egypt to the north, so that by 639 CE, they had staged a first conquest, and by 643 CE had conquered Alexandria and taken full control of Egypt. By the 700s, the Islamists had established their first sultanate in Africa. That covered the area of Tunisia, part of Algeria, and Libya, and they were looking for free labor and military service bodies. So the people initially worst affected by this Islamic expansion were the Nilo-Saharan, who were in close proximity because they inhabited the region of modern-day Sudan, South Sudan, Niger, Chad, Central Africa, and northeastern parts of Africa as well. Others initially affected were the native ancient Egyptians and the Greek and Roman descended people who hadn't converted or fled into the protection of Aksum or the Byzantine Empire. These people were often targeted and abducted in the Islamic-led human abduction raids for the caliphates. because these caliphates were first expanding west across the Sahara in Africa, with the earliest sultanate in Africa being established in the 700s in what is now Tunisia, and the next one in what is now Senegal in the 800s. It wasn't until the Sultanate of Mogadishu in the late 800s, early 900s that Islam expanded into Proto-Bantu territory. Mogadishu, before the Nilo-Saharan population occupied it, was part of the Great Lakes Proto-Bantu territory. The term Mogadishu is from a Bantu expression. It was spelled Mogadishu. And there are other places in that territory that still had their Proto-Bantu names in the 1800s. And we will get to how it got that way. It wasn't until the late 800s or 9th century that Islamic influence broke into the ancient Proto-Bantu territory at Mogadishu, which means within the life force of the great wind. And by this point, the Zanj rebellion had started in 869 CE and was in full swing. And these people who were initially taken from the Nilo-Saharan populations were looking for land and resources, and with a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, fought for what was familiar to them, which were the caliphates. The idea that the Zanj were mostly Bantu isn't accurate, because the regions worst affected by and that had come under Islamic influence between 643 and 900 CE were not Proto-Bantu regions, but Nilo-Saharan, Kushite, Aksumite, Senegal, and Tunisia. So it is important that African history stops defaulting to Bantu for everything.
The African migrations have been stressed at various points as one of the major developments from which so much can be learned about the history of the Black people. The migrations explain many things. They were people in perpetual movements. The movements were human tragedies spanning too many millenniums, for it was noted that the great pressures on the Africans actually began in prehistoric times, and that the pressures that uprooted so many settled communities came from two predictable agents of destruction: the slow and relentless incursions of oceans of sand and the slow and relentless incursions of Asian hordes. The Europeans coming later accelerated the movements. The migrations were of many different kinds, and so much so that the overall description of them is often misleading. There was no general continuous flight of people here and there all over the continent. Some of the movements were slow and limited in space, and that one might hesitate to call them migrations. These were the groups that moved only a relatively short distance each time, and as a whole, never left their general area. After 100 years, such groups might not be more than 100 miles from their traditional homes after several generations. Even in the cases of those who migrated farthest, the movement had been slow because the whole movement was forced. Every breakup, a painful uprooting of communities that had been built on hopes and dreams of a permanent abode. Every move was a search for still another abode where land and water could support life and security could assure another chance of survival. These slow-moving migrations were mentioned in the discussion of geographical influences. There were also the better-known migrations that erupted and moved south, east, and west like tidal waves. These occurred as the result of many Asian and European invasions and conquests. They were further accelerated by the new turn in the institution of slavery from the 7th century AD onward. At a much later period, after the 6th century, Black marauding groups such as the Jaga and the Ngoni added to the turmoil and disorganization. It is quite clear that the waves of Blacks that spread over Africa in these migrations came mainly from the area where Black concentration was greatest, and the attacks on the concentrations preserved relentlessly. This area of Black concentration of population was the ancient Ethiopian Empire, which I have described as the heartland of the race, its motherland with a civilization that, despite the Asian invasions, still included all Upper Egypt in 3100 BC and extended southward over the Sudan and Abyssinia. But everywhere the people from the birthplace of Black civilization wandered, they found, almost without exception, people already settled, some having preceded them by decades or centuries, and others who had been there, according to their ancestor stories, since the beginning of time. Such, for example, was the tradition of the Kete or the Kwa people of Central Africa. The intertribal wars and the intense tribalism that developed from them are among the fateful outcomes cited in connection with the migrations. I have stated a number of times that inevitably there were non-blacks in the migrations, as they were on one way or another integrated with Africans and participated with them in other developments. This means that there were always a number of predominantly black groups with some Asians and mulattoes who were as loyal to any race as any black. This is the kind of fact that blasts any attempt to indict a whole people or put them into a single category. Human beings simply refuse to be generalized into a net category. So in ancient times and even later, there were Caucasians who regarded the blacks as superior people, and the question about inherent inequality they would have sought absurd to entertain. The Greeks, the Greeks, who seem to have studied the advanced civilizations of the blacks more than any other white people, were first among this group. There were therefore always Caucasians who were affectionately drawn to the blacks as by some magic. When recognized as genuine by the blacks, the esteem became mutual, as such Caucasians became an integral part of some black groups. These were not the Caucasians, Asians, or Westerns who infiltrated black societies for domination and future conquest. These were the Caucasians, albeit a small minority, who stayed with the blacks and fought shoulder to shoulder with them against their own kind, retreated with them in defeat, and were therefore part of the migrations. I have also emphasized that not all of the mixed breeds, whether Afro-Arab or Afro-European, deserted the blacks for the whites. For while the majority did cleave to the race of their fathers, the devotion of the minority to the race of their mothers seemed to be so spiritual in nature that it more than overshadowed the white worshiping half-whites. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I'm continuing my reading of Chancellor Williams's book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. I'm reading chapter 8, The Scattering of the People, the Routes to Death and Resurrection. And he's talking about pre-colonial migrations that helped shape that pre-colonial world in Africa after the Arab, Caucasian, and Asian invasions into Africa, and all the other groups, the Persians, everybody, the Europeans, with the Greeks coming, and then later on the colonization from the Europeans in the late 1400s. But before the 1400s, we're talking about the migrations of African people from the eastern part of Africa throughout the whole of Africa, whether they went north, whether they went west or south, right? And some stayed home. But he's talking about these migrations, some forced migrations and other migrations happening for other reasons. But the hub of blackness, Ethiopia, Abyssinia, Kush, was under attack. It had been under severe attack, but now it's really under attack. And the Arabs have come in, Islam has come in, and they've completely taken over. And now black people are scrambling and moving about the continent, trying to find a place that they can call their own. And it's a challenge because a lot of these people are moving into places where they're still not safe from Islam or the Arabs or any other group, the Christians who may be coming in to get them, or they're not safe from the people who areas they may have migrated into. So it's a lot of things that's going on with a lot of these Africans who are migrating. But this helped to create new cultures and create new languages and create new customs and create new empires and create new cities and states and chiefdoms. And remember, this is all pre-colonial, right? So we're talking about the changing of the continent due to invasions before the 1400s. So the 1400s was not the first time that the continent or the countries or the regions in the continent of Africa were forced to change because of outsiders. outsiders coming in and taking over and carving it up for themselves, and the blacks are scrambling to survive. So this is a reoccurring thing. This happened before, right? Because this is what happens when people come in and invade and take over. They rename, they rework, they rewire, they regroup, they do all these things to their liking so it can reflect them. And see, that's why we're talking about what we're talking about in this video, because as we're going to read more about the migrations and the invasions, and as we already know, when it comes with changing of names and writing the history, because you won, you were the conqueror, so you get to write the history. You write the history the way you want to write it. And you tell the stories the way you tell the stories, and you make yourself the heroes. You make yourself the originators. You make yourself the overall grand theme in the story, when that's not the case. But that's why we're here reading, and that's why we're learning as much as we can. And so, all right, so chapter 8 started on page 187, and I am now picking up on page 190, the bottom paragraph of 190, white scholars as authorities. And see, getting into it. And what has all this to do with the migrations? The answer is almost everything. Much of the history of Africa has been written by anthropologists. They have written it within the theoretical framework of their own ethnology, and historians and others have relied almost entirely on their classification of peoples. The usual claim that the discipline is a science is made despite the amount of pure guessing that characterizes its conclusions. Racism is so obvious in most of the anthropological findings that one may wonder how, if they hope to maintain the fiction of being scientific, it could escape their notice. It has been suggested that their bias does not, in fact, go unnoticed, but that they are so certain of the favorable reception by the white audience to which they address themselves that what others outside of the world would think is a matter of little consequence. These latter do not supply the millions that support their African studies. The main thrust of their findings is to make Caucasians from the beginning of its history and to give the blacks not just a subordinate role, but no significant role at all in that history. Hence, their great emphasis on 1, the Caucasoid identity of this or that African tribe, and 2, failing that in a highly advanced all-black civilization where no such classification could be made, to allege Caucasian influence in one way or another. This record does not require debate. It meets the eyes in most of the books by these Africanist experts. There should be no confusion over Negroid types or Caucasoid types, where there was no such widespread mixing of races as was the case in Africa as elsewhere from the earliest times. It became even more ridiculous when it is established that certain Caucasians have Negroid features without the benefit of having any Negroid blood, and conversely, many of the blackest of the black have physical characteristics which are supposed to belong to Caucasians only. In line with their presumption in taking over the continent and reordering its racial composition, the anthropologists and their historian followers have declared that the true Negroes, Black Africans, are concentrated in West Africa only. Okay. With one wave of the magic wand and all their all-powerful scientific hand, they changed the biblical story of the black race descended from Ham through his son Cush. The plain fact that the land of Cush was ancient Ethiopia itself, and that the Cushites were blacks was simply ignored. The Cushites were classified as Caucasians. The whites and half-whites who were allied with black groups and migrated with them are singled out as the determining elements in whatever the groups achieved, even the planting of crops and irrigation techniques. The Asiatic Caucasians, who are known to have settled along the northern and eastern coast of Africa, even in prehistoric times, are now being presented as the indigenous inhabitants. The archaeologists who find the Caucasoid types centuries old in any of these areas should be taken as a simple matter of course. Nor would I think it surprising if excavations discover Caucasoid skeletons thousands years old anywhere in Africa. The same unshocked attitude is maintained when Negroid types were discovered on the British Isles. And indeed, Negroid remains have been found in other places in Europe and distant lands where no blacks are known to have lived, not to mention the millions known to have settled outside of Africa. Therefore, instead of postulating a theory of history that on the basis of a few skeletal remains, a whole people inhabited an area first, it would be more sensible to conclude that members of this or that race certainly had visited or settled in the area in the long ago, some dying there away from their own native land. But suppose they did come as permanent settlers, such as the Dutch in South Africa and the British in Rhodesia. The whites of South Africa are not waiting for the certain verdict of anthropologists and historians in their favor. They already claim to be the original inhabitants, saying, as George Peter Murdoch and his school proclaimed, that the Africans came into the land later. 1,000 years hence, there would be no dearth of Caucasoid remains in Africa. And see, this is what I've said over and over and over, like these social sciences. And these sciences were developed to help to further the ideas of racism and white supremacy. These social sciences were created to further degrade the African, to further take away the contributions of the Africans. So they go and they find things and then they report their findings and they say, well, this is proof that white people are the original inhabitants of this. This is true that the Caucasoid is the original inhabitant of this. This is true that the European is the original inhabitant of this, right? Totally burying and disregarding all of the evidence that they already have to prove that blacks are the original inhabitants, especially in Africa. Now, what Chancellor Williams is getting at is he's not saying that African people are the only people who occupied spaces in Africa. But what he is getting at is Africans are the original people who occupied spaces in Africa. And through migrations, invasions, all the different means of outsiders coming into Africa, they've worked their way into the African continent and they've worked their way into the African fabric. So yes, some of these people have been there long enough, so long that they consider themselves Africans. And they've rewritten the history in such a way to express themselves as being African people or to tell the stories as if they're African people. But Chancellor Williams is saying, yes, okay, y'all been here this long, but the originals were the African people who are being erased from history. Our history will not be erased. Now, listen to this. I just referred to George Peter Murdoch. All through these discussions, I have been unsparing in my criticism of Caucasoid scholarships at various points. I have, in effect, accused them of the subtle thievery of the achievements of an important division of the human race, deliberate and unconscionable. To understand the basis for this criticism, one need not match my labor by wading through over 100 books by them. One good example of all that I have been saying is the connection will suffice. The example is Murdoch's Africa, its people and their cultural history. For here is another one of those works, which is replete with all the trappings of profound scholarship, bearing all such works invariably do to mark the scientific objectivity. Yet from beginning to end, Murdoch maintains his central theme. Africans are not, in fact, Africans. Black civilization was not, in fact, Black civilization. Countless people thought to be Negroes by many, such as the Bushmen, the Maasai, Cushites, Pygmies, even the Bantu, etc., are of Caucasian origins. And while his own account of migrations often contradicts his main thesis, this, I suppose, he dismisses as simply unavoidable. He was at his racist best he was at his racist best in his suspicious and rather amusing argument that attempted to prove that even the Asmanians were not Black. It is not significant that so many white writers spend so much time and energy trying to make this or that person or group non-African. And from what we've been reading in my research, especially the Bantu group, from my understanding, would be a group of mixed race people. A group of mixed race people from that would, I believe, include some Caucasoid and some African mixture. I believe, if I'm correct, the Bantu people. So there is some kind of Caucasian in there with the Bantu, but to say they come from strictly Caucasian origins is crazy. Along with we're not going to use the word pygmy, but the Twa and Booty people, the Kushites, the Maasai, the Bushmen. We all know, like, we can go to Africa today and see the remnants of those cultures and those people in Africa from those people who still live in the so-called primitive ways. We can still see some of the archaeological findings and all the evidence that they left that these were African people, and these people described themselves as Black African people. Certain direct consequences of the migrations will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city states from which varieties of cultural patterns inevitably emerge. These outcomes highlight the factors of segmentation and the decline of advanced Black institutions. But migrations from the first centers of Black culture in the Sudan and Egypt had beneficial results also, right? So the migrations were a new kind of missionaries. They carried whatever they could of their advanced civilization wherever they went, and they carried it far and wide. The backwards groups that had been living far away from the centers of progress were the beneficiaries. An economic revolution occurred in areas where the Nile migrants not only brought new grain crops, but also new implements and farming techniques. They also spread the gospel of industrial production through the expansion of crafts and their organization into guilds. The greatest of these was iron. For iron, all by itself, created the greatest industrial revolution in Africa and became at once both the catalyst and foundation of the new state formations and expansions of power. In like manner, basic African institutions such as the traditional constitutional and social systems were reinforced by the migrations from the heartland. And while many of these basic institutions were influenced and modified by Islam and Christian Europe, they all remain so unyielding at the core that they can be studied today almost as directly as they could have been 5,000 years ago. There's another fact in this connection that is not pointed out often and never stressed. We generally speak glibly enough about Asian and Western influence on Black Africa, but seldom about the influence of Africa on Asian and Western institutions. The process of Africanization began at once whenever and wherever the Blacks came in contact with foreign institutions. Both Islam and Christianity had to yield to Africanization. Even autocratic sultans and emirs, all powerful in Asia, clashed head on with the constitutional role of the council in Africa and had to yield. The religions that spread almost rapidly and widely were those which were readily adaptable to African cultural patterns. Islam and the Catholic Church led in this, and the Catholic Church outdistanced every other Christian denomination in growth. A large volume should be written on the African influence on both Asian and Western civilization, since that influence began in ancient times, was not limited to Caucasians on the African continent, but was carried to other lands by migrating whites who themselves had been Africanized. African values did not die even among the millions of slaves who were transplanted to distant lands. In the United States, where the systems to stamp out every vestige of Black culture was most thoroughgoing and relentless, African traditions persisted and influenced not only the white slave-owning class, but the course of American civilization itself. The historical significance of the movement of people, no matter under what circumstances, can hardly be overemphasized. And I love that point that Chancellor Williams is hammering home. Just because some of these groups were on the run, and just because some of these groups of people were subjugated, doesn't mean that these groups of people did not have influence even over their oppressors. And a good example is using Black American culture. White culture has been the dominant culture in America, but Black culture has been the most influential culture in America, right? And Black culture, Black American culture, not only influences Black American culture, but it influences the cultures of the world. Even though Black people are seen as third, fourth class citizens in the United States, and we're seen as a low class of people throughout the world. But the cultural influence and the cultural traits that we have still go out. That's how you have people in Asia who break dance and I saw a video of a group of Asians. I'm not sure what country, but they had a band, and their whole band style was a SWAC HBCU band style. Where did Asians on the continent of Asia learn a SWAC HBCU band style? Where did they learn that at? But that's the culture, because we're talking about HBCU culture. We're not talking about dominant college culture like white culture. We're talking about HBCU culture. They're not mimicking Ohio State, right? They're not mimicking the Ohio State Buckeyes band. They're mimicking a SWAC HBCU band in some small town somewhere in the South somewhere, right? But that's the influence that Chancellor Williams is talking about, that a subjugated people can still have over its oppressors, but also talking about everything that comes from the migrations, all of the languages that will be created, all of the customs that will be created, all of the new ways of living, all the new people. Even if you have Afro-Asians or Afro-Arabs, all these different groups of people who may be mixing all these different things. But one thing Chancellor is getting at is keeping the African customs and the African traditions alive and well, and not handing them over for any other thing, whether it's Islam, Christianity, any other thing, not handing them over, remaining African at the core. So we have seen how and why the flights of blacks from the Sudan increased, and the Arab hordes continued to sweep in during the 13th century, and Islamization was more aggressively pushed. Too many blacks leaving the homeland. What was happening was far worse than the sight of their cities, towns, and villages going up in flames. For now, they saw their victory over leaders, kings, and other nobles, divesting themselves of a tradition of civilization that went back beyond history into Paleolithic times, and for expediency or self-interest, were humbly grasping for the robes of the Arabs, their language, and their religion. Their leaders on the throne were no longer Africans or Ethiopians. They were now of still another race. They were Black Arabs, because their mind had been changed. Their minds have been changed, programming. So it did not matter at all that the new states were forming under Black Arab rule. The Arabs not only tolerated these Black Muslim rulers, sultans, and emirs, but found it expedient to use them as fronts in controlling the remaining Black population. The real rulers were the various Arab tribes that were now scattered all over the Sudan. There was a great difference between these new Black Muslim states and the Fung. For the Fung were also a sultanate in name. It had a long line of Black rulers who steadfastly refused to be Arabized, basically turned Arab, right? Even to the extent of accepting Arabic names. And even the Arab population knew very well that the Muslim religion of those Black sultans was very superficial indeed. The new French states of Darfur, Wadai, and others under Black Muslims offered no place of refuge for those whose very reason for flight was to maintain their own racial identity, dignity, and religion. And see, going back a couple of videos when we talked about the Fung, right? Them creating their own, them having to migrate, having to flee, having to migrate, and then recreating their own empire and becoming a force and a problem for the Arabs, and the problem for Islam, and the problem for everybody who was their enemies, right? But also them maintaining the African minds, the African consciousness, not giving up their African consciousness, right? It's like, look, we're going to stand, and we're going to stand for something. Not only are we going to stand up, we're going to stand for something, and we're going to stand for something that's African, and we're going to maintain who we are and where we come from and our traditions, and we're not going to change mentally, internally, spiritually for nobody. And that made them a threat. The others who were apt to change, who were willing to change, they became a tool, a pet. The same way that the Europeans use African people as pets today, the same way that those Arabs and those Asians use those African people as pets then. You go do our bidding, and then we discard you. But the people who maintained the African minds were willing to be eliminated to maintain their African minds and their freedom and their autonomy, and not fold and not cower to their enemies. Now we're talking about how the Sahara played a role in the disbursement of the people, but also the change in the Sahara and how that changed the landscape of Africa. It changed cultures and changed the way people existed and where people existed. So we return to the Sahara again, for here is where the first Black migrations begin before written history. Sahara or wasteland indicates what it became, nor what it was. It was the largest northern region in Balad as Sudan, the land of the Blacks. Viewing this vast area for at least 5,000 years, it is difficult to believe that it was not forever this. And basically, we're talking about the Sahara Desert being a lush green forest land, a rich land of lakes, rivers, oceans of water, grasslands, as far as you can see, trees, animals, all type of wildlife, all type of people. There was thriving life in the Sahara Desert before it became what we know what it is now. But the Sahara, far bigger than the United States, was once a land of lakes, rivers, forests, green fields, farms, villages, towns, and cities. Wildlife was abundant. Cattle grazed in meadows, and horse-drawn chariots spread over the highways. It was a great land, yet only a part of an even greater Black world. We have already noted that this Black African world had been under relentless pressure from the seacoast by invading whites from the earliest times. Canaanites, Hebrews, Phoenicians, Mongols, Arabs, Berbers, Greeks, Romans, etc., etc., right? It was all pointed out that it is not without significance that even today, most of the invaders occupy the same areas where they first came in, the seacoast. For centuries, these whites must have been received with the traditional African hospitality. They were the immigrants, settlers, and traders. Many, like the early Blacks themselves, were seafaring men. That the Blacks were once among the adventurous peoples that the Blacks were once among the most adventurous of peoples, and is evidenced not only by the presence of their descendants in many lands and numerous far-flung islands, but also by archaeological remains found in various parts of Europe. It seems clear, therefore, that the whites were not regarded as invaders with ulterior motives, but as co-partners in the further development of world trade. There was no obvious reason to think otherwise. No particular significance was seen in the fact that the whites always massed along the seacoast and built their towns and trading posts, strongholds there. The Blacks were also in these same coastal areas. There was a general mixing or amalgamation of the race also from the earliest times. In this area, the offsprings of Blacks and white Berbers and Arabs became known as Moors, Tuaregs, Tipu, or the Fulani. Like Afro-Americans, they were of every conceivable complexion, some of the whitest having Negro blood. The scientists on Africa, however, classify even the darkest skinned of these groups as Caucasoid. And I know this to be a fact. Like I said, certain videos and information I put out in the past, particularly information about Hannibal Barca. And you'll always have people saying Hannibal wasn't Black and Phoenicians wasn't Black and Carthage wasn't Black. There were no Black people in Phoenicia and there were no Black people in Carthage. And it was a multiracial place, but Black people didn't exist there. African people didn't exist in a multiracial place, right? So saying Hannibal was a Black man, to them is saying that Phoenicians and Carthage was an all-Black empire. No, that's saying Hannibal was a Black man. Hannibal was of African origins. That's all we're saying. But we already have enough information to know that, like the Americas, these North African areas were multiracial areas. And they were multiracial areas way before we even knew, because I've always thought that the Sahara Desert was always the Sahara Desert. And then when I learned that it was a lush forested land, grasslands, like all the greenery you can imagine, So I'm like, okay, well, I need to learn more about this African continent. But we know people existed there as well. And multi groups of people, multiracial groups of people existed in these areas. So, and like Chancellor Williams is getting at, and that's because a lot of these people existed on these sea coast, these areas along the sea coast, but that allowed them more access to the trading routes as well. The sandstorms at first began their long and relentless rampage over hundreds of miles, but only as previously deforesting and the disappearance of grasslands made this easy. The desiccation began far back in time, probably during a period of well after Quaternary times began. No one knows how long that awful process of drying up lakes and rivers lasted. What is crystal clear is that during the ensuing migrations, the Black made their greatest and most tragic era. It was an era to be fraught with the direst historical consequences for the whole Black race. Instead of moving en masse to the seacoast and maintaining the dominant position there, which they could have done easily, they moved en masse toward the interior, first to the remaining oases in the desert, and then onto the northern and southern Ethiopia, and to the south and central and western regions. The Berbers, Arabs, and their Afro-Asian offsprings, the Moors and the Tuaregs, now firmly held the entire northern, northwestern, and eastern seaboard of Africa, right? Settled along the seacoast. This tremendous victory of the white man was not achieved by conquest. It was achieved by default on the part of a race too preoccupied with the imminent present and less with the future, and a race whose centuries of blind trust in the white man passes all understanding. One might say that in surrendering all their seacoast areas to the Asians and mulattoes, and apparently without a fight except in the case of Lower Egypt, that the Blacks not only sealed themselves off from the world commerce and general international relations, but they also, and at the same time, sealed their own fate to be surrounded, hemmed in hunting grounds for slaves. The pattern for Egypt and Axum was clear cut. Their story was already outlined early enough, and so clearly that even the blind could not be unaware of the shape of things to come. That shape emerged in their present. The whites were aggressive, always relentlessly pushing for the common position in every situation, no matter how small their number or how insignificant the project. The Blacks, by contrast, were not so aggressive, tend toward the brotherhood approach, and generally strike only in retaliation for prior wrongdoings. This overall humane and essentially religious attitude of the Blacks led Arnold Toynbee to say that mankind may have to emulate them if civilization is to be saved. Right. This is hardly a compliment in a world where the very meaning of civilization is lost. In the face of the Caucasian will to power and domination, this religion of meekness is a tactic surrender to the permanent overlordship of the aggressive and the strong. This is the testimony of history. And perhaps this is why I have always been puzzled by the declaration of Jesus Christ that the meek would inherit the earth. Did he mean the grave? And basically, Chancellor Williams is getting at one of the same things that Dr. John Henry Clark got at. The meek, because Dr. John Henry Clark said, the meek shall inherit the earth, but the strong will inherit the meek. So basically, what our historians are telling us is we are too nice, too humane, too accommodating, too barbaric people. And we need to learn how to have some barbarism in us as well. We treat warlike people like humans, and they don't treat us like humans in return, en masse. Now, we're not saying every single one of them, but en masse, in return, they don't treat us like humans. But our continuous, guess you could say, our continuous reaction to their actions is kindness, love, kindness, love, kindness, love, humanity, kindness, love, humanity, kindness, love, humanity. And while their domination, war, white supremacy, domination, war, white supremacy, domination, war, Arab supremacy, domination, war, Asian supremacy, all of the groups of people, African people have always been too welcoming. I'm always talking about the cookout. I'm always talking about how Black people are always always, always, always welcoming somebody who's not black to the cookout. We haven't learned that invasions don't always have to come in a malicious and a violent form. It can come in peace. And then next thing you know, they've taken over everything. Social and economic mobility came from the circumstances that the blacks made up the strongest contingents of the Berber and Arab armies. Some became commanders. Others became chief counselors to sultans. Most males were castrated, however, or removed from the possible contact with all females. An equally significant group was the labor force of enslaved blacks. Now, does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar for what the slave masters in America used to do, because they saw the black men as perpetual sexual threats to the white women, so they would castrate them. So the Arab armies were notorious for doing that, for making what they call eunuchs, castrate them so they won't be a sexual contender to them. These were highly important because they relieved the white Asians from all labor. The blacks, who were skilled craftsmen in various fields, fared better since they were generally spared from the whip. The plight of the blacks in white-dominated areas, including their enslavement, would have been different if the masses had not scattered in small groups over the trackless Sahara, the Nile Valley, Ethiopia, and other regions of the continent. The others referred to were the blacks who remained where they were, as their once vast and fertile homeland slowly turned into Sahara of wasteland, right? Geologists, archaeologists, and other specialists have all advanced various theories to explain the great mystery of the transforming Sahara. We need not retell their interesting story here, for every explanation needs to project still another puzzling question. For me at any rate, and this is what Chancellor Williams is saying. For example, just how did the Albion Sea, a vast inland body of water as large as France, disappear in the Sahara? How many cities and towns lie buried under these mountains of sand and rocks? And so there's a lot of African history that could very well possibly be buried under the Sahara, under the sand dunes of the Sahara Desert. And this history could tell us a lot about the original inhabitants of that area. But it can tell us a lot about people who overall inhabited that area, right? So I think that'll be something good to be able to get into, like excavating areas of the Sahara Desert to see what civilizations and what groups of people existed there before the Sahara became what it is, this arid land, this arid wasteland of a desert. But also it would be cool to see what the Sahara area actually looked like what it really looked like before it became a desert. But you know, we're also talking about the lost lessons of history. The lost lessons of history that have to be implemented. This is why culture has to be passed down. You know, we think about how we'll be, let's say we're shooting a breeze at a family function with some friends or something. They got young people and old people there, and a song comes on and the young person doesn't know the song. And the parent of the young person is shocked that the young person doesn't know the song, because that's one of the parents' favorite songs. But the parent never put the child on the song. They never taught the child about the song. So when the song comes on, they're shocked that the child doesn't know the song. And like, how you don't know that song? That's my favorite song. And the child is like, never heard that song a day in my life. Culture is not passed. That's just a small example of how culture isn't passed down. Stories isn't passed. Stories aren't passed. Information isn't passed. We're not reading. They already said if you want to hide information from a black person, put it in the book. They're putting this information in these books, and we're not reading. We're refusing to read. We would read everything but our history. And even if we do read it, are we learning? Because clearly we didn't, because that's why we're in the situation that we're in now. But how could we get out of it? And how could we fare better moving forward in the future? So we make sure future generations don't fall for the same tricks. Like their ancestors, they continue to be settled communities of farmers and craftsmen, the kind of communities where civilization itself is born, but also like their ancestors and all other advancing peoples, they were vulnerable to the widely ranging camel riding Berber and Arab nomads. These tent dwelling raiders gained absolute control of all the trans-Saharan trade routes, with their kinsmen in control of all commercial seaports. They had effective control of the economic life of Africa and therefore Africa itself. The matter of making that control more complete by raiding and enslaving the blacks and scattered oasis communities became relatively easy. Direct contacts with Europe and Asia meant the possession of the largest superior weapons which the blacks were unable to secure, the firearms. So when guns came into the play, guns came into the fold, things changed. Things really changed, but African people still didn't have access to the guns like all the other people did. So like the Asians and the Arabs did, they didn't have the access to the guns. Because they didn't have access to the guns, they were still behind the 8 ball. Guns gave people an upper hand. All right. So let me read this last part to you. This is the ethnology and the migrations. The great story of the Sahara is yet to be told. Archaeology has hardly scratched the surface beneath which a lost civilization lies buried under several thousand feet of sand and rocks. How far westward did the effective rule of the ancient people, of the ancient empire extend? How many kingdoms were there, and by what African names were they known? Were the fringe states, such as ancient Ghana, that were found fighting for survival on the edges of the desert, once a part of a vast imperial system? There is some evidence that this may have been the case, but the actual fact remains unknown and speculation becomes an idle pastime. What is known is that the migrations from the Sahara, while heavily concentrated in Upper Egypt and the Eastern Sudan, also spread out over Africa in and through the Western Sudan. I may seem to have overemphasized the ethnic composition of some migrating groups by repeating references to it, but it is so important that white historians have bypassed it in order to establish a new theory of prehistoric Caucasian occupation in Africa. Have they not found supposedly Caucasoid remains and artifacts in different places? According to this theory, the whites in their conquest of Africa were simply returning to their own original homeland, but where now is the homeland of the blacks. Our Africanist experts do not know, some few apparently, seeing how ridiculous was the corner into which they have pinned themselves, suggest that perhaps the blacks migrated from India or somewhere in Europe. So the Caucasians were just coming home. That's why you can find Caucasian remains in Africa, not because Caucasians existed there along with Africans, but because the Caucasians existed there before the Africans. The Africans came, the Caucasians came back to Africa to conquer what was already theirs. This is the story that the Caucasian scholars or historians are saying. Others undertake to establish Caucasian priority in Africa by excavating structures which no Negroes could have built. An example is a prehistoric site in Uganda. They found what seems to have been a well-built fortification of earthwork, reservoirs, dams for irrigation, trenches, and pit dwellings. All this indicated the mass organization and skills of a superior people, such as the Sidamo, for example. Nowhere in East Africa, the author concludes, are Negro peoples either Bantu nor Neolithic, known to have built structures even remotely comparable to these. This, like 1,000 similar false statements about Africans, requires no answer. The facts now are well known. But let us not miss the central point in all this. The Sidmo people, cited by this anthropologist as the probable builders of these structures, are themselves Black Africans, as Black and as African as are the anthropologists' Bantu and Neolithic groups. I have lived among all three groups. Some of the people in each group are of mixed blood as a sample of matter of course. just as American blacks are mixed. But in their pathological drive to prevent any concepts of unity from emerging in Africa, Caucasian scholars have been relentless in dividing the blacks of Africa into numerous ethnic groups. This grand strategy was designed to make each group feel unique, special, and hostile to all other groups. The development of different languages and the scattering and isolated societies that was the most favorable situation for the division of the blacks and the furtherance of hostility among them. Divide those Negroes and then conquer those Negroes. Divide those Negroes to make it easier to conquer those Negroes. Because if we can conquer those Negroes, then Africa is ours, and we can tell the stories the way we want to tell the stories. So that's going to conclude my reading for this chapter. It ends on page 207. So it goes from page 1. What's this? One what? It goes from page 187 to 207. So 187 to 207 is what I read for this particular video. Of course, I didn't read the whole chapter, but I read pieces of the chapter, and I left some work for you to go read and fill in some of the blanks. And well, I did fill in some of the blanks, but it's other information that you should just read. Just go read the book. The link is in the description for you to get the book. My Amazon affiliate link is in the description. Click that link to get your copy of Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams if you haven't already. Also, like this video, comment, subscribe, share. Make sure as many people as possible see this video, get this information. For those who have not read Destruction of Black Civilization, this is an introduction. I'm reading it for you so you can sit back and let me give you the information, but also go and read the book for yourself. Support on the Shoulders of Giants. I appreciate everybody who's been supporting on the Shoulders of Giants. I believe YouTube has some shadow banning going on, so please hit this like button. Please share this so as many people can see this video as possible, because information has to get out. Remember, you all chose the book, and we're going to make sure this information from this book gets out. The Destruction of Black Civilization. But remember, one thing that I am learning, the destruction of the Black civilization started within the minds of the Black people first. The minds were destroyed, and they destroyed themselves. It was internal and external destruction. So we cannot continue to destroy ourselves internally and then complain about the destruction externally, because we make ourselves more vulnerable. We have to understand the nature of human beings, the nature of groups of people. People dominate other people. The day of being meek and humble, those days are over. We're either going to learn how to stand up for ourselves and fight for ourselves and fight for everything that's ours for ourselves and stop being so accommodating. We're either going to learn from that, or we're going to continue to suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer into the future. Then we're going to set our kids up and our kids' kids and our kids' kids up to suffer as well. So it's either going to stop now or never. I'm Joseph Ward. I love you all, and make sure y'all catch the next video coming up.